editing and proofreading. So, the focus of this discussion is largely aimed at preventing you from ending up in the position where you are doing the thing that you see in the video in front of you, which is repeatedly hitting the backspace or the delete button on your keyboard because you don't like how something sounds, or you want to kind of make a change to a sentence you just finished writing. We're going to talk today about editing as part of a broader process. This writing and deleting all the time, it's very inefficient. We don't want to do it. We actually want to use a process that has, as you can see, 3 stages and overall 9 different phases. Now, I'm not going to get into stage 1, pre-writing, and stage 2, writing, today. I used to cover them in an earlier kind of grad rate presentation I used to do, but someone else does that now, so I'm mostly going to focus on stage 3, revision, which has 4 different phases in it, and I'm going to kind of go through the different phases. Essentially, what you're trying to accomplish, like the reason why when we do writing at a kind of professional level, we talk about drafts, is because as you go through different drafts, you're actually assessing different potential problems with the writing, so that your focus is limited to looking for this thing and only this thing. You may see lots of other problems as you go along, but you're not really attending to those problems as you go, because you're trying to stay focused on one particular issue. So when you're editing, the first, once you finish writing that first draft, I always encourage students to think that the first draft is their draft. It's where you're taking the kind of outline that you developed with all the point form notes in their proper sequence and turning that into sentences and paragraphs. Just to talk briefly about stage 2, which is the writing stage, some of you may have noticed there's only like one stage and one phase within that stage. I don't even call it phase 5 because it's really just the stage itself. Just write. That's all you do during stage 2. Write sentences that have spelling errors in them, write sentences that have grammatical problems and mechanical problems, write sentences that have ambiguous wording, incorrect information, whatever the case may be. Your only job in the second stage of this process is to turn all of the point form notes that you've gone to great trouble to put in their proper sequence in the outline phase. You're trying to turn that into full sentences and paragraphs in the writing stage. And you are accepting the reality that, and this is important, you are accepting the reality that the writing is going to be awful in that stage. But it doesn't matter. You wrote it for you, not for anybody else. And you're okay with it being awful because you know you're going to make changes to it. If you can accept this reality, if you can accept that this is the way things are going to go, believe me that actually fixing the problems will go much faster than trying to fix them while you are writing, which is very difficult to do. So treat this as 2 separate kind of processes. So after you write that first draft, which is entirely for your own eyes, it's going to be full of mistakes and problems, the first thing that you're going to assess is the clarity and content, because clarity is your number 1 priority in your writing. You need to ensure that your reader actually understands what you are conveying to them. And the content you need to make sure is correct and credible, and everything that needs to be there is there. Those are your 2 most kind of important, like 1 and 1A concerns for your writing. I would say too, a kind of early tip that I will give you is once you finish writing that first draft, avoid it for at least 4 to 5 days. The longer you wait, the better, because that first draft that you write entirely for yourself, when you write it, you are kind of in a particular place in your mind where what you wrote makes good sense to you. But probably all of you have experienced this before. If you wait a week, or especially like if you look at an old piece of writing like a year later or several years later, and you read it and you think, oh God, this is awful, what was I talking about in this piece of writing? The reason why you're able to notice the problems with the writing after time has passed is because your brain is in an entirely different place by that point, and some of the unclear areas in your expression are now abundantly clear to you where they wouldn't have been before. So the more time you leave off confronting that draft, the more you will see once you actually start into it. So, on the first reading, assess the argument or the central claim that is at the basis of what you're looking at. Is it consistently the same from one paragraph to the next, from one chapter to the next? Does the evidence support what you're contending? Do you make clear connections between evidence and thesis? Have you answered the question, proven the point that you've set out to prove? Is all the information complete and correct? Have you explained everything in a way your audience will understand? And are all of the different topics relevant to your purpose? In other words, you haven't gone down some tangent or some kind of sidetrack. Once you have assessed the kind of central claim and the presentation of evidence around it in your writing, you can start to make changes. So when it comes to keeping the same argument throughout, and does the evidence support what you're contending? If you have problems at this level, you might have to go back and do some significant rethinking about what your project actually is. Do you make clear connections between evidence and the thesis? Add sentences to the ends of paragraphs, and I'm going to kind of give you an example of that in a couple minutes. Have you answered the question, proven your point? Make necessary corrections where possible? Have you explained everything in a way your audience will understand? Use simpler language? And are all of the different topics relevant to your purpose? Cut and paste unneeded writing. I always say cut and paste it instead of just delete it, because as graduate students, as kind of future scholars, you can assume that any writing, any research you've done, and any writing that has come out of the research you've done is maybe not immediately relevant to the needs that you have for a project, but it might be in the future. So hang on to it, because you might reuse it later on. So never delete work that you've actually kind of put a lot of effort into producing. So making connections. This is kind of a simple concept, but it's actually kind of left out an awful lot. So when you're presenting evidence to support a kind of consistent claim throughout a work, it's very important at the end of a section or at the end of a chapter or something that you remind the reader of what that claim is, and kind of allow them to see that the evidence you've just presented does the job of supporting that claim. So if, for example, the paper that we're writing is a article review for this article on infant simulator programs and preventing teen pregnancy in The Lancet, then we have a thesis that the study relies on a limited sample size and qualitative evidence which casts doubts on its conclusions. So that's the central claim behind how we're reviewing this article. We're essentially saying the article is of limited value to this discipline because it, doesn't use enough, it doesn't talk to enough mothers, I guess, teenage mothers. So we say in one of the paragraphs, we're presenting evidence, we say the authors concede that their study was limited given the, quote, quite low participation rate at the individual level, unquote. In fact, the actual number of participants in both control and intervention groups hovered around 50% in all schools, so there's our citation. We don't want to leave this idea where it is without first connecting it and showing the reader how. And so, like, right away, it's safe to say a bad practice is to have a citation end a particular paragraph or section, like to let someone else have the last word. Usually you want to have the last word, and you want that last word to be something that points out to the reader, I am still doing the job of presenting evidence to make you convinced of a particular claim. So we want to add to this by referencing this idea of limited sample size. Just clarifying, this level of participation does not provide enough data with which to draw accurate conclusions. So there's the kind of correlation with what we're talking about in the thesis. Using the exact same wording so that the reader, their brain kind of is signaled to the fact that, oh, right, that's the claim that you're supporting. Simplifying language, this is just a bunch of silly examples to demonstrate what I talked about on Monday with, the importance of avoiding big fancy words. So, yeah, you use a dictionary to find words from text that you don't understand, but not to add to your vocabulary. You, especially as graduate students, you should already have a kind of operative vocabulary based on the readings you've done in your discipline, the jargon particular to that discipline. You don't need to expand your vocabulary to sound more academic. You want to use simple words to explain complex ideas rather than the other way around. So we can call these $5 words, and just to, as again, a silly illustration of how these big fancy words make understanding so much more difficult. The common English expression rendered in more kind of inflated language, it is fruitless to attempt to indoctrinate a superannuated canine with innovative maneuvers. Probably those of you listening who have encountered the English expression, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, were maybe able to guess that that was what the kind of revised version was saying, but it's difficult to actually kind of see that in the use of the wording. They do actually say the same thing, but one is just using language that is way too elevated and difficult to understand.
Unless you're an English student.
This particular cliche, and we will call it a cliche, we use in English to describe not dogs, but mostly people. And we're making reference to the idea that people who are older and who are more set in their ways find it difficult to adapt to new ideas and new technologies and everything else. They can't learn new tricks. The example I would say was, teaching your grandmother over and over again how to access her email. And you wonder, like, how can she not know how to do this? But you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Not to say that your grandmother's a dog, it's just an expression to capture this idea. And by the way, it captures this idea much better and much more clearly, even though it's a metaphor, than do the very fancy words, the, fruitless to attempt to indoctrinate a superannuated canine. Another silly example, scintillate, asteroid minified, is just another way of saying twinkle, twinkle, little star. So these words are not helpful. They're impressive, but they're confusing. They don't help your reader understand what it is you're referring to. Exclusive dedication and necessary chores without interludes of hedonistic diversions tends to render Jack a habitudinous fellow. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, for those of you who have seen The Shining. Or a revolving lithic conglomerate accumulates no diminutive glaucous bryophytic plants. A rolling stone gathers no moss. Again, this expression meaning as people grow older, if they remain active, they will be healthier. But that idea is not easily conveyed by using such inflated language. Jargon, is again a type of language you are expected to use in your writing. It's particular to your discipline, but make sure that you use jargon in a way that your readers, the readers that you anticipate reading your work. This is why, for example, we have a lay summary or a general summary in a lot of graduate level writing. It's your opportunity to eliminate a lot of the technical jargon that you use. And jargon is all over the place. This particular example that I've included, he dangles the biscuit through the hash marks and back. Backhands is shooting with the reverse edge of the stick, and the top shelf is the top part of the net. So if you don't watch hockey and you're not used to the morning sports report, this description might be a little bit confusing for you. But if you do, you're familiar with the jargon and you kind of speak the language, so you're not confused. So you have to be careful with your, who are your anticipated audience members, and how easily can they follow your use of the jargon in your writing. Science jargon. Use it, you have to use it, but use it intelligently. Don't overdo it, again, just to make the writing sound impressive. So again, as a very kind of over-exaggerated example, the avian embryo nutrient cartridge, or AENC, is a self-contained, semi-permeable, biomineralized, calcium-encased, osmotic, gallinaceous epigenetic environment capable in fertilized and maternal or radiant incubated mode of full-term ornithological development support and in unfertilized mode of interspecific anthropoid trophic uptake after thermal-mechanical processing. Now, if I was giving this presentation in person, I'd often ask, what is it? It's an egg. So in your scientific writing, just say egg. Don't say all of this stuff. It sounds impressive, but it takes your readers a second to understand what it is you're actually referring to. Similarly, the Passive Solar Illumination Assembly, or PSIA, is a vertically installed moisture-resistant photon transmission aperture for sub-exospheric microclimate monitoring with polished, planar, transparent, amorphous fused silicate surfaces and manually adjustable gaseous infiltration-exfiltration capability. That's a fancy way of saying window. So again, don't make your reader guess window when you can just say window. Your task with writing as a graduate student is not to impress anybody with the size of your vocabulary. Would be a good rule to follow even when writing with scientific jargon. Okay, so next draft, we are looking for something different. In the previous draft phase, we attended to all the problems related to clarity and content. We now know that everything in the paper is supposed to be there. It's doing the job of presenting evidence to support the argument. We've clarified everything related to the argument, including how the evidence supports it. But there's still problems. Some of them might be related to how we have sequenced information. If you've done a really good job, by the way, of developing an outline in the first stage 1, phase 4, which is the outlining stage, you probably won't have much to do in this phase, which is nice. But you can still go through the draft process just to check things and see how they look. So you're reading through the second draft to determine if your introduction includes your topic, thesis, hypothesis, research question, objective, roadmap, etc. Whatever the particular ingredients of the introduction are supposed to be there, are they there? And is the introduction the first thing? It's kind of elementary stuff, but do check it. Do you have any necessary background information described or defined before it is needed? So you don't want your readers looking for that background information or being surprised by some technique or some theory or something that you haven't explained yet. You explain it before they need it. Make sure that the evidence is well placed to reinforce the argument you're making. This is where you kind of assess, like, is this a strong point in favor of what I'm saying? Is it a less strong or a little bit slightly weaker point? Which should come first? Which should come last? Counter arguments do not detract from the point you're making. As graduate students, you are expected to show how the claims you are making are situated within the broader literature. That would include people who disagree with you. But you maybe don't want to put the people who disagree with you right at the end before you kind of conclude, because that plants seeds of doubt in your reader's imagination as to the efficacy of your persuasiveness. And now you make more changes. So when it comes to the introduction, best version of your thesis goes in the introduction. Focused information is gradually more specific. I'm going to kind of give an exemplar of writing introductions. Background information, include it in a separate paragraph or section. This is very common in writing, to have an introduction where you say, this is my project, this is what I'm trying to convince you of. Okay, now hit the pause button for a second. For a paragraph or for a few paragraphs, I'm actually going to not argue anything. I'm just going to give you information, because you need to know this stuff once you get into the kind of meat of the actual discussion. That's perfectly acceptable to do. Evidence is well placed to reinforce your argument. Cut and paste. Just move things around to make sure that things are in their optimal kind of order. And counter arguments, sandwich them between strong points of evidence. Don't leave them off till the end, where they will plant those seeds of doubt. Okay, introductions. You want them to go from general to more specific. So again, some of this will seem rather elementary. But by the way, again, if going back to the actual full process that I'm describing, if introductions are something that you hate writing, if you've done a good job developing an outline in phase 4, when you get to the writing stage 2, you don't need to start at the introduction. You want to, if at all possible, avoid starting the paper you're writing with the introduction, which most people find to be difficult to do. A lot of writing experts will say the introduction is the second last thing you produce, right before the conclusion. So abstracts get thrown in there too. They'd probably be the last thing even after the conclusion, but provided, I'm sure Paul talked about this when he talked about abstracts the other day, provided you don't have to produce the abstract before you've actually written the paper, which is one of those things about academia that's always interesting and funny. But introductions you leave off as long as you can. Once you have to write them, you know that this inverted triangle is the kind of shape of information that you're trying to produce. So as an exemplar, let's pretend that the prompt that I'm responding to is discuss America's rise to global superpower. I'm supposed to write a paper that attends to this idea. My first sentence, my topic sentence, the sentence that answers for the reader the question, what is this piece of paper I'm holding in my hand? What is this whole thing about? And I start with, since the dawn of time, human beings...
Epigraph is better.
...one another. No, not a good topic sentence. Because one of the things that, if it's answering the question, what is this piece of paper I'm holding in my hand, keep in mind, it's signaling something to the reader about your actual, objectives in the actual paper. What are you going to cover, in other words? And you're not going to cover the entirety of recorded human history, right? So don't signal that that's what your project is in the first sentence. Okay, a little bit better. From 1776 to the current day, America has sought to dominate the world. It's more specific than the last one, sure, but it's still way too big because it still seems to present a project that you could not reliably talk about in one paper. So that's no good either. How about, in the second half of the 20th century, American hegemony, militarily, economically, and politically, was rooted in its industrial capacity. So this is pretty good.
it tells my reader that, first of all, contextually, we are limiting ourselves to the second half of the 20th century when America was a global superpower, both in three respects, militarily, economically, and politically. But that those three things were largely dependent on, America's ability to produce things, its industrial capacity. So they have some idea of okay, what is the topic of this paper going to focus on? In essence, I'm saying my topic in responding to the question is I'm going to talk about industrial capacity. Context sentence is where you become more refined, you get closer to the specific claim that you're making by limiting it in time and in space and in the particular focus. So prior to World War II, popular sentiment for political isolationism had prevented or delayed U.S. involvement in European conflicts. So I'm trying to describe a time prior to America's rise to global superpower. Then my focus sentence is reestablishing the idea of industrialism. So, however, American industrialists were always keen to sell their wares to one or both sides in any such conflict, and so economic enterprise was the motivation behind eventual American participation. And now I come with thesis. In fact, the American Lend-Lease program of World War II was not only indirectly responsible for U.S. participation in that war, but also ultimately for its ascendancy to world superpower. There might be some history students listening in who are openly scoffing at my introduction right now. That's fair. I'm not trying to pretend that this particular example would actually make for a good paper. I'm just trying to demonstrate the idea of how you kind of become progressively more kind of focused. So I've gone from, at the beginning, the idea of American power being rooted in industrial capacity to making the somewhat contentious claim that, in fact, it was one program during World War II that essentially kind of led to this global superpower status. And then I would often, in many cases, provide a roadmap to express to my reader, expect that I'm going to touch on these kind of key ideas in relation to the presentation of evidence to support this somewhat contentious claim. This is how you write an introduction. So if you just have this general idea of general topic, provide context related to that topic, reestablish the focus, then what is the argument, then how are you going to actually present the argument? These are kind of the 5 key ingredients, I guess, of presenting an argument. If you're writing in the sciences, this is somewhat similar with the one kind of change that you're, rather than thesis statement, you're actually stating the research objective or a research question or something like that. That research objective or research question actually becomes a thesis statement, believe it or not, by the time you are in your discussion. Also, in your discussion section, which is, in fact, a kind of mini essay, or an essay, really, at the graduate level, it is an essay. You are making a central claim, which is something, at the very least, some variation of, the method that I used to kind of address this particular problem was a sound and good method. And as evidence, I offer some of my results. So your hypothesis still morphs into a thesis at some point. So all of this information is still kind of relevant to what you're trying to achieve as well. Okay, that brings us to the 8th phase. This is where you are assessing for style. I should mention that when graduate students come to the Writing Support Center and they've specifically been sent there by their thesis supervisors, usually this is the problem, style. And again, in some cases, the supervisor will say your writing is not at a graduate level, or this is not academic enough, or something like that. So this is where I always have to ask very specific questions, because this tells me that your supervisor has a very particular idea about how information should be conveyed, how it should sound, what the sentence structure should be. I think I mentioned the other day about length of sentences. There's somewhere at Western, maybe still here, maybe not, a bio professor who's convinced that sentences should not be longer than 7 words. Jeez. So that professor would probably send their student to the writing center and say, you need help with style. Like your sentences are too long and they include too much information. Get help with this. I need to kind of clarify for all of you, style is it's like your fingerprints, right? It's like unique to you. The way you want to present information is, and that's what style is, writing style, is particular to each individual person. And I never try and tell students that come to see me how their writing should sound, per se. I can point out to them where their writing is kind of swaying into more casual styles, using more kind of colloquial language and things like that. I never tell them you need to get rid of that, but I will tell them, like, just be aware this is becoming very conversational in its tone. But your supervisor will tell you, like, dead stop, this style is not acceptable. And for them it's not, and that's just something that you're going to have to contend with. I often describe, and I'm not the only one to do it, so don't pretend that I'm claiming this as my own, but I often describe supervisors as like your primary gatekeepers, right? Like they're the ones standing in front of the portal or threshold that you want to pass through and go on with your career in academia, and they're stopping you from crossing through, and they're saying, until your work kind of looks and sounds the way I want it to, you shall not pass. So you need to make changes to the way you express yourself in writing to accommodate that person's expectations. Once you're past that person, once you've passed through the gate, you've moved on to publishing your own articles under your own name and everything else, you can go back to the style that you think is appropriate, and you will find out, in that case, from publishers whether or not it's acceptable or not. But the point is, you have to sometimes talk to your supervisor to find out what the specific expectations related to style are before you get into this part of the process. But look for things like flow, which is to just say transitions between different sections, coherence, that idea, tone, formal versus informal, sentence variety, rhetorical devices, word choices, go back to this idea of jargon, concision, which we talked about on Monday. And then again, you make more changes. When it comes to flow, insert words and sentences to make connections between the different ideas, the competing ideas. Tone, eliminate the imprecise language. We talked about tone the other day as well. Sentence variety, use more complex sentences. By complex, I don't mean complicated. I mean what I described 2 days ago, yesterday, come to think of it. I talked about complex sentences when I was talking about commas. And complex sentences are sentences that have both a dependent and independent clause, and you can put the dependent clause at the beginning, which is something a lot of writers don't do because they've been told never to start a sentence with the word because. Well, you can do it. Now you know how to do it. So increase sentence variety by using more complex sentences. Rhetorical devices, limit to only what is needed. Don't overdo it. The more often you use rhetorical devices, the more you kind of dilute their impact. Word choices, jargon, remember that clarity is your number one priority, and concision, I've already shown you a bunch of strategies for concision. You essentially just pare your sentences down to essential ideas. Okay, so talking about transitions. Basic level that we use is enumeration, first, second, third. First I'm going to talk about this, second this, third this. Be careful with enumeration, I will say. I have read many papers where students will enumerate the points that they want to make, first this, second this, third this, they get to the second point. Second, I'm going to attend to this idea, which is broken up into these three components, which are 1, 2, 3. The first component is this. The second component is this, but it has 7 different questions related to it. Do you see why it becomes a problem when you enumerate? Because you start adding all of these other numbers, and the reader becomes kind of confused as to, wait, which number system are we on here? So be careful with using these as transitions. They're very basic. You can probably do better. Intermediate level is like using these particular transitional signals, additionally, consequently, finally, etc., etc. We have a PDF handout on our website under Writing Resources that has all of these different transition signals grouped according to the relationship you're trying to describe, so you feel free to check that out. The advanced level is where you use intentional repetition to signal to your reader's brain, oh yes, I just saw that, and now I'm seeing it again in a new context. So the example that I use here are 2 paragraphs where I'm talking about writing. In the first paragraph, I'm talking about redundancy. In the second paragraph, I'm talking about transitions. These are 2 completely different kind of concerns in writing, but you will see that I do manage to bridge the gap between them. I say redundant words and statements should be eliminated after the 3rd reading of an essay. Removing this filler will consequently reduce your word count. However, you will likely increase your word count once again when you incorporate transitional words and phrases into the paper. Creating transitions between the different ideas you present is not always easy, but it can be accomplished by using key words. What are the key words in this particular case that signal this transition? They are word count. Again, when I use them, when I repeat them that way, my reader's brain is kind of signaled that, oh, right, I just saw that, but in a slightly different context. But it smooths over the kind of transition into the new idea so that they can see, oh, both are connected by this particular point or idea. When it comes to tone, we talked about tone the other day, but just to reiterate, so if we put 50 milliliters of sodium alginate in the mixture, we can get a lot of good results that will make the last step of the process less hard. There are a lot of tone issues in this example. Here they all are. So first of all, so if we put, who's we? Who are you referring to? Are you referring to yourself plus the reader? Again, are you assuming that they are a peer, a fellow researcher who is perhaps trying to replicate this work? And should you be assuming that? What if you changed you? So if you put, well then who's you? Again, you're assuming a lot about the reader. Some people will say, well, what if I use one, like this hypothetical person, if one puts 50 milliliters of sodium alginate? I would ask the same question, who is that person? The question is, do you even need to mention a person in reference to this idea? Put, way too many uses in English, a very versatile word for spoken English, but not so much for written English. We mentioned get before and how many different definitions there are for get. A lot. This is an illustration for both those of you who have English as your first language and those who do not. This is an illustration of how language evolves over time. Where did we come up with this expression a lot to mean many? Well, originally it's rooted in the same word that we have that gives us the word lottery, but not the Powerball lottery or something like that we think of nowadays. A lottery that was originally intended in the settlement of North America for lots of land. In fact, originally the lot was the little piece of paper that entitled the bearer of that piece of paper to the tract of land that was part of the deed. Now, those lots of land, as they came to be called, had, ponds and rivers and trees, and once they started building on them, fields with crops and barns, and so they had many things contained within them. Sometimes when they were paved over, they could contain many cars, and we called them a parking lot. And this is how, over many generations, a lot came to mean
many. But this word, stretched way out of its original meaning, is not quite as precise as many or much, which are much better words to use when you're trying to capture this idea of a surplus of things. Good. By good, do we mean like as the opposite of evil, or do we mean just positive? 71 different uses for make, too many. Hard versus soft, or hard as in difficult. So here's all of the different tone problems in this example. How would we change it? Well, again, eliminating we, just adding 50 milliliters of sodium alginate to the mixture ensures positive rather than good results that will mitigate the final stage of the process instead of making it less hard. None of these words are particularly with possible exception of mitigate, but I credit all of you with knowing what this word means. I think none of these words are difficult to understand, but the tone is much improved. Concise writing, we went over some of this the other day, but for those of you who weren't in attendance or just as a refresher, nouns that could be verbs. Students have a tendency to make exaggerated statements about their busy schedules. How about just get rid of the exaggerated statements and tendency, turn them into verbs. Students tend to exaggerate their busy schedules. Redundancy on the word level, positive benefits, prove conclusively, connected together. At the sentence level, the document is necessary because it clearly identifies the selection criteria. It is a requirement that these criteria be described in detail. Necessary is equivalent to required. Identify is equivalent to described. So we're repeating ourselves. Clutter phrases, I also went over the other day, so I won't belabor this, but in all cases, all, in order to, in the course of, when or during, in the event that, if, in the near future, soon, in the vicinity of, near, in view of the fact that, considering, is often the case that, often, it is possible that the cause is, possibly caused, it is this, that, just this, it would appear that, apparently, large numbers of, many, rectangular in character, can just be rectangular, masses are of large size, can just be large masses, and necessitates the inclusion of, would be must include. Again, I'm not saying you can't have the versions on the left-hand side of the screen, I'm merely saying you don't have to. And that brings us to phase 9, grammar and punctuation. I've already talked about both of these examples in detail. I won't go into too much. I will say, this is the phase, this is the final polish where you kind of are looking for any problems in grammar or punctuation. Might take several drafts. If you know you use pronouns a lot and maybe misuse them, maybe do one draft just where you're identifying all the pronouns. So my suggestion in that case would be to use the search function in Microsoft Word to look for it, that, this, and maybe they, and ask yourself, is it clear what I'm talking about? If we're talking about archery and I say I will set up the target and when I nod my head, shoot at it, is it clear that I'm talking about the target and not my head? Dr. Macklin often brings his dog Champion to visit with patients. He just loves to give big, wet, sloppy kisses. So, again, the pronoun he, a little bit ambiguous. Prepositions is not something I really talked about in grammar the other day, but just for those of you who struggle with, particularly in, on, and at, here is a bit of a kind of mnemonic that you can use, which kind of memory aid, let's call it, which is the inverted triangle with in at the top being the most general and at the bottom being the most specific. This works particularly well for time phrases because the in we use with the largest, most undefined time periods and at for the most specific. In entire years, like in 1984, or in months, in September, in the 21st century. On we use for days of the week, on May 4th, on Tuesday, And at we use for times of the clock, like at 3 p.m. or at noon. Location-based or space-based prepositions are a little bit more difficult than this, but at the very least, in and at still apply. Because in you use for the biggest kind of regions and areas, like in Canada, in the city, in the known universe, that kind of thing. At you use for specific locations, like at Western or at my house. On, prepositionally for space-based expressions, we use for on the surface of something. On Earth versus in the world. Because we're talking about the round planet and we walk on its surface, or on the table. Now, some people might wonder, well, what about internet stuff? Why do you say on the internet or on a web page? That's because in English, everything that is internet-based is an extension of the idea of the printed word, and printed words are printed on the surface of a piece of paper. So even though the internet is kind of in your computer, we still say on the internet or on a web page to reflect its origin in printed media. As far as in and at, there is one exception too that some of you are probably wondering about. If I told you to meet me at Weldon Library, that's pretty specific. What if I told you to meet me in Weldon Library? And yes, I know my picture of Weldon Library is very outdated for those of you who have only been in there recently. This is what it used to look like when it was more tomb-like. Yeah, in Weldon Library in this example is more specific, but keep in mind, in this case, in Weldon Library is actually short for inside Weldon Library. In other words, within 4 walls and a ceiling. So don't confuse the in terms of large geographical areas with the inside of specific locations where there are 4 walls and a ceiling, because they are distinct. More prepositions, of and for. How to make the distinction between these two things? Well, I've mentioned before that of is a particle that we use to indicate possession. The sword of Damocles. We would more often say in English, Damocles' sword. But if we want to emphasize the thing that is possessed, we would flip the order, the sword of Damocles. We use it for relation, the University of Western Ontario, or causation, the source of the problem. For we usually use associated with an action. Though these words are not included in the sentence, you can think of it as for the purpose of doing something. So when we look at this, this same example, the sword of Damocles versus the sword for Damocles, the sword for Damocles is for the purpose of giving a gift to Damocles. It's intended for him. Once I give it to him, it will be the sword of Damocles. It will change in how we describe it. But before it's given to him, it's for him. The easiest way I find of explaining the difference between of and for is with peanut butter. I would die for peanut butter means I love it so much. I would die for the purpose of eating it. I would die of peanut butter goes to causation. I'm allergic to peanuts, and eating them would cause me to go into shock. So please keep them away from me. Very, very important distinction. Conditional sentences. This is where we differentiate. This is appropriate given where we are in history right now. What's the difference? A, I will vote for a competent person, or B, I would vote for a competent person. Well, A describes the actual case, whereas B describes a hypothetical situation. So we are a little over 1 month removed from the American election. So if I was an American at this moment in history, I would vote for a competent person. It describes a hypothetical situation because if you're Canadian, the B example, you're not able to vote in their elections. But if you are an American, as an American at this moment in history, I will vote. This is my actual intention because we have an election coming up. And again, it's just over just now.
So actual case, can, will, shall. Conditional or speculative case, could, would, should. Could and would also function as the past tense forms of can and will. Faulty parallelism, another thing related to grammar we didn't talk about the other day, but often found in students' writing. By running new scans, the researchers wanted clearer results to verify their early conclusions and finding more usable data. So probably all of you see the problem here. We have used a noun form, an infinitive form, and a gerund form to explain the three things that the researchers were doing by running new scans. Which one you pick is entirely up to you. The faulty parallelism problem comes in the fact that you haven't used the same one for all three items, and you want to do that. So you can use a noun for all three. By running new scans, the researchers wanted clearer results, verification of their early conclusions, and more usable data. You can use infinitives for all three. By running new scans, the researchers wanted to see clearer results, to verify their early conclusions, and to find more usable data. Or you can use gerunds for all three. By running new scans, the researchers were seeking clearer results, verifying their early conclusions, and finding more usable data. It doesn't matter which one you choose. All three are equally good, I would say. They're only good because they are consistently the same with each item. Subject-verb agreement, a pretty common problem in writing. In English, noun plus S equals verb without the S, whereas noun minus the S equals verb plus the S for singular. But that can be tricky depending on how the sentence is set up. So here's an example. Female black widow spiders, a dangerous type of insect, kill or kills the males of the species after mating. For those of you who are thinking kill without the S, you are correct. Because again, if we remove the non-restrictive clause, a dangerous type of insect, which is, first of all, which is a dangerous type of insect, there we know it's a non-restrictive clause. That's not essential information to the sentence. It can be removed, which leaves us with female black widow spiders kill the males of the species after mating. So we want kill. What about this example, though? Neither the shark nor the zombies like apple pie. Now, in this somewhat rare syntactic construction, you base the verb off of its a proximity rule. Which of the nouns is closer? In this case, zombies, the plural noun, is closer, so the verb becomes like. If, however, you reverse the order, neither the zombies nor the shark likes apple pie, because now the singular shark is closest to the verb. Alright, that's it. I just had to fold in some extra grammar stuff that I wasn't able to talk about the other day. I hope that answers just about everybody's questions.